I tell you what,
it's not like the olden days.
I'm Rosie.
I'm Jake.
And this is our podcast on George Romero's original Dead trilogy, which consists of Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, and Day of the Dead. And it's very clever because that's the order in which time happens: night, dawn, day. And also, they reflect what's going on in the films. They were made really rather a long time apart from each other.
Night of the Living Dead was released in 1968, unrated, in a kind of Saturday matinee slot that was freaking out all the children, because nobody really knew what sort of film it was going to be, because it invented, as we've mentioned before, the zombie film subgenre. 10 years later, in 1978, George Romero released his follow-up to Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, having given up the living part of the title to his creative partner from the first film, John Russo, who may have taken the living part of the title for his own sequels, but not really the mythos and the iconic zombie, which belong entirely to George Romero, and rightly so. He came up with them, crafted them from some of John Russo's original ideas. Day of the Dead was released in 1985, so a slightly shorter gap that time. There's then a gap of 20 years before George Romero released his second Dead trilogy, really on the back of other films trying to cash in on the subgenre he himself had created so many years ago, and not doing a particularly good job of it, and he himself joined in with cashing in on his old success and not doing a particularly good job of it either. Land of the Dead, Diary of the Dead, and Survival of the Dead are not worth talking about, which is why we're not going to. And they're not times of day either. They don't fit in any way.
In Night of the Living Dead, no one uses the term zombie. I understand that critics coined that term for this particular kind of supernatural / sci-fi monster, inspired by presumably the original use of the word zombie, which was a person, and not even a dead person, in a kind of a thrall. And it was generally presented as, in the media, I don't know about in real life, a white person doing it to savages, as they used to call non-white people in colonial Africa and places like that. And they go around in a kind of trance and do his bidding. There's a very old black and white film called White Zombie, in which this is done to a white woman, and it's absolutely horrific. Whereas now, a zombie is thought of as an undead person who goes around in a kind of trance and eats the flesh of the living.
They're always referred to in the Night of the Living Dead script as ghouls, and of course the concept of the monster that was going to be the threat in Night of the Living Dead went through a lot of changes during the creative process. John Russo was keen on the idea of aliens, and the remnant of that idea is in Night of the Living Dead, with the explanation for the zombies rising being this strange radiation from the space probe that's come back from Venus. And originally, John Russo wanted it to be a lot more sci-fi than that, and of course George Romero doesn't like that sci-fi explanation. He wants to keep it all a complete mystery, which is why in Dawn and Day, it's all a complete mystery why it's happening, and the radiation from space theory is never mentioned. I remember pointing out at one time, Night of the Living Dead is quite a spoiler of the title, and when the news report shocks the characters by saying the unburied dead are returning to life and committing acts of homicide, that's pretty shocking for the audience too, except for the fact that it's in the title, Night of the Living Dead, and then when you realise the original title was going to be Night of the Flesh Eaters, that would have been a very horrifying, unexpected reveal. Of course, originally those flesh eaters weren't necessarily going to be zombies. They might have been aliens or some sort of other monster. But that's what they ended up as, the zombie as we know it today. We've talked about genre starters. This is a sub-genre of horror film starter. Quite by accident, George Romero created, in spite of John Russo's help perhaps, rather than because of it, a whole new, very enduring type of movie monster. And really, any sort of zombie tropes you see around can be traced back in some way to that movie. So it's an extraordinarily relevant, interesting, and very well pulled off piece of cinema history.
Something that is very annoying, and which is the fault of John Russo, is that it's impossible, for me anyway, to get a set of all three of those films in the right form. Wherever these items were listed, there were a lot of reviews by very angry people saying, "What the hell is this? This isn't the original Night of the Living Dead. It's the one with stupid extra scenes by John Russo and a different score." So I thought, well, I'm not going to risk that. Stupid extra scenes with this priest character talking nonsense and what have you. Oh, here's a German one. I expect they've got it in English, haven't they? Yes, languages, German, English. And then as you watch the three movies on this German box set, it gets increasingly more frustrating. The first one isn't frustrating at all. It's just what you want, just what you're trying to avoid by not getting the English releases. And then the second one, Dawn of the Dead, they've cut bits. They've cut the zombies getting shot in the face and getting their heads chopped up by helicopter blades and taking bites out of people. And as you were saying, what really is the point of watching a film without those things?
That's right. You can't enjoy a zombie movie if you don't see the zombies doing what zombies do and people shooting them in the head because of it. Whatever satire and social commentary there to take away from it mean nothing without the base of the zombie action.
And then what do you get with Day of the Dead? You end up with the cut German version, because Day of the Dead had cut bits and it also didn't have the original English sound. So I did end up with the right version of Night of the Living Dead, which is the important thing, and I had to go and find other copies of the other two movies.
Everyone hates that John Russo's 30th anniversary recut of Night of the Living Dead. Interestingly enough, he gets back the original zombie, who was called Bill Hintzman, to film new scenes, give that zombie a backstory as a murderer who's just been executed. But you can very much tell that in the new scenes he's 30 years older than in the proper movie. And that's just one thing that makes it the wrong way to watch Night of the Living Dead.
It's also John Russo, who is being a dead zombie, not an undead zombie any longer, but one that's been killed, and moves his eyes in the close-up. So we don't have very much time for John Russo. Although I agree with him that a sci-fi explanation for the brain being reanimated is a good idea. It's just my opinion, really, but I think dead bodies rising really needs something like that more than, say, ghosts or anything from an other world.
Yes, I've always liked having that explanation in the movie. It feeds into the controversy from the time about space travel, whether it's a good idea for various reasons, and if it's going to start bringing back unburied dead bodies as flesh-eating ghouls. It's not really a very good idea, is it? That kind of sci-fi explanation does make it more tangible and chilling, I find.
In the other two movies, where we don't know what's causing it, someone will inevitably start talking about God or hell, which personally I don't really relate to. Generally speaking, although we may find there are other tangents and things, there are two things to really talk about and analyse in all three of the films. One thing is the zombies, and the other thing is the characters, the living people.
There is an ongoing theme with the living people about the real problem of surviving a zombie apocalypse being cooperation, communication, or people's lack of ability to function as a cooperative group when the chips are really down. It's fighting amongst themselves that really does for them. It's featured in different ways and to different degrees in all three movies. It's something that's very much continued in his inferior later trilogy, which we're not mentioning. And it's not just the nature of humanity that's interesting to spot in these movies, it's also the nature of the zombies, whether you want to think they're a form of humanity, as some characters do, or a whole new life form, or are they even a life form, a whole new being. They do have an interesting kind of journey, evolution through the movies.
Talking about that first original zombie, played by Bill Hintzman, there are observations people have made about him specifically, that when he's after Barbara, having killed her brother Johnny, he's a lot faster than zombies will become. He's more intelligent in the sense that he picks up a brick or a rock or something and tries to break her car window. There is mention in Dawn of the Dead as well, I believe, of zombies using tools, and this doctor character saying they use tools like apes and monkeys might pick up a stick and use it. But also, as a rule, the zombies are fast and they're very tenacious in Night of the Living Dead. And if one of the living people wants to step outside to get to the truck or whatever, it's very difficult. And there are a lot of zombies clutching at him because it will be a man who does this in the 60s. You have to have a flaming stick with you and really fight them off. Whereas in Dawn of the Dead, a thing that I actually find quite irritating is that the zombies are so slow that when it suits the plot and suits what's going on in the script, you can run right through a whole load of them and they'll barely even start to turn round before you're out of sight. A bit later on in that film, when they want the zombies molesting and eating people, they do get better at it, but there's a sequence where some looters have come to the shopping mall. They're running through these zombies, taunting them, laughing at them, pieing them in the face. And at that stage, the zombies are doing very little about it, and it just strikes me whenever I see that no one would think of trying to do this to the zombies in Night of the Living Dead. They're far too dangerous. A thing that really gets lost from Night of the Living Dead is that the zombies will nearly always kill you, perhaps with a tool, before eating you. The child down in the basement kills her mother with a farming trowel. Johnny is killed by getting pushed over onto a headstone and hitting his head on it. Thereafter, the zombies will eat you alive, but even that can be traced back to Night of the Living Dead because that little girl is dying of a zombie bite. One of the zombies has gone straight for the bite while she was alive, which is not particularly consistent with what they're doing at that point.
It really is the origin of you get bitten and you turn, which you see in so many things.
In Dawn of the Dead, Peter says after the character called Roger has been bitten that he's never seen anyone live for more than 3 days after being bitten. And then in Day of the Dead, Sarah, with a little help from her friends, amputates Miguel's arm where he's been bitten. And when she's challenged during all this non-cooperation that's going on, she says, "I cut off his arm before the infection spread." So increasingly more, you're getting this idea of a zombie bite being a reproductive kind of a thing, like a werewolf bite. And that may not have been what George Romero meant, but it's something that's very easy to take away from it, especially if you don't happen to remember everything that was said in Night of the Living Dead about the unburied dead, radiation, characters rising again when they've been shot, for example.
When I first watched Day of the Dead, that was something that annoyed me about it. I wondered if George really did remember his own mythology. That thing with the arm I thought was rather incongruous. And I was disappointed that, unlike the first two movies, you don't get characters we've known as humans coming back as zombies, which is rather chilling, frightening, unnerving. And really, specifically, with one character, as you mentioned, being shot, his brain is definitely intact and he should be coming back as a zombie as part of the movie. But it's just not written into Day of the Dead's whole concept.
coming back after being shot is what happened to Harry, the horrible, unreasonable husband slash father who wants to hunker down in the basement with his wife Helen and child, this dying girl Karen, and take all the food and guns and everything, and anyone who doesn't want to go with him can be left to their fate. And he deserves to be shot, and he's shot by Ben, who really is the main character. People do like to make something of Ben being black because, quite understandably, it was 1968. Most parts played by a black actor were written by a black actor. So people suggest that maybe Harry has some kind of prejudice against a black man and that's why he doesn't want to cooperate with him. But it's not, it's just because he's uncooperative. That the sheriff's department at the end shoot him in the head without checking he's a zombie because he's black, so it kind of doesn't matter to them either way. However, they're not checking anyone's a zombie. You can see that quite clearly. It's effectively built up to. The part was written for a man, and they gave Dwayne Jones the part because Dwayne Jones played the part best. And he is very good. The rest of the cast is fine, but it was a low-budget film.
It's very much a sort of collaborative effort to make a film between a certain group of people from Pittsburgh. The actors who play Johnny and Harry are also producers. The woman who plays Helen is really his wife, and that's really their daughter, playing the two characters' daughter. They're all using their filmmaking skills, both in front of and behind the camera, to put together the best film they can, and bringing in a strong lead actor, Dwayne Jones, and he leads the film very well.
I haven't mentioned the death of Barbara. When the zombies start crashing through their boarded up windows into the house and she sees Johnny as a zombie, she kind of just gets swept up in them. She's become unhinged anyway from the shock of being attacked by Bill, the original zombie, and seeing him kill her brother. And there are two other characters in this house as well, Tom and Judy, fresh-faced, young, college age, I think, couple who actually like each other, and they're the first to go by blowing themselves up in the truck in which they're trying to escape. Tom's trying to fill it up with gas. The house has its own gas pump and sloshes the gas everywhere and sets fire to the truck with the flames that they're using to keep the zombies off. I don't know if they meant to imply that Tom's just really stupid and can't control a petrol pump, or if the petrol pump's a bit faulty and it'll slosh gas anyway and Tom wasn't prepared for that.
I always used to think it was getting sloshy because they had to shoot the lock off it and it had been damaged. I'm not entirely sure that's true now. Tom might just be clumsy.
And then getting in the truck and driving off in it while it's on fire definitely is a stupid thing to do. And when I first watched it, I remember thinking, oh, they've blown themselves up in the truck, have they? That's a shame. But I guess Ben and Barbara will survive, and then off they go one by one, and you're left with Ben, and I think, well, Ben's going to survive because he is the one that we like best and the one whose side we're on. But then, as I said, he gets shot in the head by the sheriff's department, and I then remember thinking, well, what's the point of that then? None of the protagonists survive.
It took George Romero until he was redrafting the end of Dawn of the Dead to realise, well, some protagonists should survive. We've been following them through the movie. We'd like to see at least some hope for the future, even if they haven't got much fuel left at the end of Dawn of the Dead. And that's definitely the right decision. It's disappointing when everyone dies. Of course, at the end of Night of the Living Dead, it seems that although our main cast are all dead, the situation as a whole might be under control. And indeed, in John Russo's Living Dead sequels, he's coming from the point of that original zombie apocalypse was sorted out, but now there's going to be a new one thanks to this trioxin thing that he's made up. Whereas George Romero says, aha, well, the situation may have been contained in rural communities like this, but if we go to 3 weeks later into the same apocalypse in Dawn of the Dead and look at a big city like Philadelphia, where people are hoarding dead bodies in city-funded housing projects, we'll see that the whole country is about to fall apart. And then when we get today, which is certainly a minimum of a year Dawn of the Dead in the movie timeline, the world's been completely overrun. Obviously, Barbara agrees with me that it's unnerving to see someone who used to be alive now as a zombie, or at least she feels that way about her brother Johnny, with whom she's driven to rural Pennsylvania to put a wreath on their father's grave, very grudgingly, at least in Johnny's case. Karen, the little girl, has more to do as a zombie than as a living person movie, and I think it's a very important part where she actually says a few words of discomfort to her mother, so that we can then compare that to her wandering around eating her father's arm, stabbing her mother to death with a trowel, and then coming upstairs and going after Ben. That was one very important part they omitted from the 1990 remake of Night of the Living Dead, actually having the daughter be human. Yes, the main problems in cooperation in that one do stem from Harry being stubborn and narrow-minded and unfair. They do make a kind of tentative plan at one point to fall back to the cellar if necessary, and there really comes a point, it's the point where Barbara is getting overwhelmed by zombies. The point just before that would have been a good time, when all their barricades are coming down, to fall back to the cellar. If everyone had done that together, cooperatively, they just have had to shoot the couple of zombies that were already down there, or about to be down there, because there were dead bodies down there, and hold out until the morning.
There are 4 protagonists in Dawn of the Dead. They don't do too badly as a team at all, really. It's individual flaws that do for the individual. They have a helicopter. I think it's a much better idea to go and find an island with plenty of fish and stuff, but instead they decide to stay in this shopping mall, which is a new idea in the 1970s, and when they're first flying towards it and seeing all the parking spaces in this big building, Peter's response to it is, "What the hell is it?" What stops it working, really, is these looters coming later that pie the zombies in the face. Before that, we've had one of the 4 die, Roger, but that's because he's kind of stupid and he's too overconfident and isn't careful enough not to get bitten by the zombies.
The satire in Dawn of the mindless consumerism turning everyday people into zombies is quite clear, easy to understand, but very true and very pertinent, and has only got truer since 1978.
The other 2 people are Stephen and Fran, who are a couple who hate each other, rather like Helen and Harry, and you find out not too far into the film that they're expecting a baby, and I am pretty sure when I heard that I thought, well, Fran will be alright then. Probably by that point I was kind of hoping that Stephen would die. He's very annoying. Roger and Peter are these zombie-killing hardcore alpha males, and Stephen wants to compete with them. One very memorable thing he does is go chasing after them down into the mall, having been unconscious for a bit, nicking the only gun that they have up there from Fran, and that's why she gets into a bit of trouble with the Hare Krishna zombie, and the men have to come up and save her, and you might think she seems like she's a bit weak, but having had her gun nicked off her, I can see how that came about.
That's the sort of thing where this quartet do need to work on their teamwork. They're certainly the best functioning group we meet within the Romero movies, but there are certain strengths and weaknesses that needed to be factored into plans like that do lead to trouble. Apparently, Galen Ross, who played Fran, refused to scream during the movie. The script, which you can find on the internet if you have a mind to, directs her to scream in certain places. And she's like, well, I don't want to be a weak female character. I'm not going to scream. of course, standing there doing absolutely nothing while she should be passing Stephen the hammer to help him deal with the zombie, is just as bad in its own way. But even in that original script, George has done his best to combat the issue of his female characters being nothing but a burden. Like anything, I suppose, it's a progression, it's a work in progress. It gets taken to extremes in Day of the Dead, with Sarah, our main protagonist.
I do find that rather irritating, that it has to be shoved in our faces how strong Sarah is. Miguel, who has to get his arm cut off later on, who I mentioned earlier, is portrayed as a very weak and cowardly character. George seems to feel the need to do this in order to strengthen the woman. The first thing they're doing is flying around in their helicopter looking for survivors, and as soon as they get back to their base, Miguel says to her, "Oh, I know you're strong, everybody knows you're strong, and now the audience knows you're strong too," and I think that's very unnecessary. Nobody felt the need to say that to Ben or Peter. It does make me laugh in Night of the Living Dead because that's 1968 and it's a product of its time, when they're debating rather heatedly whether they should try and get away from the house and go to one of these safe places, local high schools and community centres and things. And Harry's objection is, we have a sick child, 2 women, and 1 woman out of her mind. And the 2 women, just by being women, are quite as bad as the sick child and the woman out of her mind.
That is a difficult part for actress Judith O'Dea as Barbara, having to sit there and be catatonic for most of the movie after really leading the first 10 minutes of it. I always notice the bit where George does bother showing us Barbara reacting to the revelation that it's the unburied dead coming back to attack them. Only a small reaction, but clearly she finds it even more horrifying than anything she was imagining. A subtle but good piece of acting from Judith there. I think Ken Foray, or as we always call him, Keenan's dad, does an excellent job of leading, very much like Dwayne Jones did in the first one. Most of the action and the emotional input in Dawn of the Dead, and it would be very unsatisfying to see him go through with his plan to commit suicide, and Fran then decide to chop her own head off by sticking it in the rotor blades as the end of the movie.
Fran and Stephen work for the telly. Stephen does the traffic reports, and that's why he has a helicopter. And one thing that Fran does that makes her a modern woman is say, I want to learn how to fly the helicopter. I want to be able to get away if anything happens to you, Stephen. Stephen dies as well, and as I was saying, I'm not at all sorry. He dies of a couple of things, really. Getting shot in the arm by the looters, and a load of zombies come into the elevator with him and bite him up.
Stephen's death is caused by his own recklessness, of course. When the looters come, Peter is planning to stay out of sight and just try to make things as difficult as possible for the looters by locking some stores. But of course, Stephen starts shooting at them and starts a war, as Peter puts it. What they really should have done, of course, was just stay behind their fake wall until the looters had gone, and then clear out the mall again. In the script, it says Stephen is just shambling about as zombies do, sees the fake wall, and something in him remembers. But whether it's remembers he wants to be up there, or remembers that there's people to eat up there, I guess George wants us to decide for ourselves. When I first watched Dawn, the idea of a zombie baby did occur to me, and I'm not the only. You can trace anything that's explored the idea of a zombie baby back to Fran. Everyone thinking, oh, that could put a spanner in the works in a couple of different ways. It's something that did occur to me while watching it. And obviously some others too, some of whom went on to make the Dawn of the Dead remake, reimagining in 2004, which has a zombie baby in it very briefly. Personally, I'd like to think that a deleted scene from the end of Day of the Dead shows that Sarah, John and Bill have some neighbours on this desert island of theirs. It's Peter, Fran and a child who've all been living there happily and are very pleased to have Sarah, John and Bill as neighbours.
Zombies having instincts, remembering is part of it, having a survival instinct is another part of it, is an idea that's really quite central to Day of the Dead. course, to expand on what I said earlier about the titles, in Dawn of the Dead, it's become obvious they are taking over. In Day of the Dead, they are having their day.
It's kind of ironic that Day of the Dead doesn't have very much daylight in it. Characters live underground, but of course, as you say, night, dawn, and day really refer to the stage that the zombie apocalypse is at.
We've mentioned Sarah as well. John flies the helicopter, and Bill does, trying to talk to people on the radio. There's a Dr. Fisher who's their friend as well, but quite honestly, he's not very interesting. But a very interesting character with whom he works is Dr. Logan. They call him Frankenstein. He's this kind of mad professor. He experiments on the live zombies, as it were. For instance, one of them has his entire digestive system missing, and Logan demonstrates how he still wants to eat him. There's one he animates by hooking it up to some buttons that he pushes, and he's all very fascinated by it and thinks it's the most wonderful thing. We're introduced to him showing the stuff to Sarah, who finds it rather disgusting and nearly throws up. And it's very striking when he's late for the meeting that they're going to have because he's been so busy working on his corpses and he wants something to eat after not having eaten for several hours, and he's all covered with blood and it's all spattered up his white doctor's coat that he wears. You get the feeling that he has always had the potential to go completely mad and turn into this crazy professor, and in the zombie apocalypse it's the perfect environment for him to go over the edge. One of the experiments he's doing is with a zombie whom he called Bob, after his father. Bob is an unusually well-behaved zombie. He actually says he's had to kill other zombies who have been too aggressive and not responsive. Bob is a zombie who he has, in a sense, tamed. We see him showing him a toothbrush, which he doesn't like and throws away, but he remembers how to open a book and look inside. He likes listening to music on the Walkman, and he gets upset when Dr. Logan turns it off, and Dr. Logan shows him how to turn the music on again. And it's quite moving, really, when Bob is sad to see Dr. Logan shot dead towards the end. As you were saying, that's where he really should rise again. And Bob would like that, wouldn't he?
It would be interesting. The pupil would become the teacher, and Bob would remind Logan how to be human.
A short way into this experimenting with Bob stuff, we find that he was in the military. When Captain Rhodes, who's the antagonist, comes into the room, Bob salutes him, recognises the gun, is afraid when the gun is pointed at him. So perhaps the military discipline that has been instilled in him is what makes him obedient, able to respond to these experiments.
In Land of the Dead, which we're not talking about at all, George Romero has zombies growing to care about each other as part of their evolution. I was moved to remark this time it's much more interesting with Bob. He's actually developing feelings about individual human beings. He's developed a kind of love, a kind of parent-child love with Dr. Logan. He develops a particular dislike of Captain Rhodes, who's shown hostility towards Dr. Logan, and Bob realises has had him killed. And thus Bob goes after Rhodes with the gun in revenge, and mockingly salutes him as Rhodes is being eaten alive. Bob is an extremely interesting character. He is a whole new being. A zombie who is developing his own thoughts, feelings, emotions, which in some ways may be shaped by his residual memories of being human in the first place, and in some ways are shaped by the experiences he's having as a zombie. I always found the evolution of the zombies by Day of the Dead very interesting. When we first see the zombie corral and Steele is trying to attract the attention of the zombies so they can collect a couple of specimens, as they have been doing for at least a year, it's the first time we see the zombies' instinct to attack people being overridden by some sort of survival instinct. Sarah says they're learning. They know that when zombies get caught in the corral, they don't come back. And the zombies are developing some sort of desire to keep existing. They don't want to be taken away and not come back. I think it's fair to say that Day of the Dead is the one where lack of cooperation between the living people is the biggest problem. It's a pretty big problem in Night. It's not much of a problem in Dawn, as you say. It's individual people bringing about their own downfall. But in Day, if they all cooperated, the scientists and the military, they could find a way out of it. But it's all about this little society, perhaps the last remaining human society in the United States of America, collapsing because it just can't work together. And I do enjoy the very over-the-top pantomime villain performance of Joe Pilato as Captain Rhodes. The military guys with the guns are prepared to follow his lead, and they're none of them very good, nice people who are going to be able to get on with the scientists. Sarah, John and Bill very much are built up as the characters you do want to see escape in the helicopter. Unlike Dr. Fisher, we know them pretty well, we care about them, and it's a shame for the military guys that none of them could make themselves into protagonists as well. It's Steele who's the luckiest of all of them by getting to take the easy way out by committing suicide before he is devoured. Everyone always writes him as Private Steele in the summaries, but he's got a chevron on his arm, so he must be some sort of corporal, and he seems to be second in command to Rhodes.
The one called Rickles is stupid because he has the opportunity to shoot himself. He's trying to run away and finding zombies at every turn and screaming, and then starts getting eaten alive, but he's got a gun in his hand. I don't think he's run out of bullets. I remember thinking it would be very striking if, having given up on trying to shoot the zombies, Steele put the gun in his mouth and found he'd run out of bullets and he had to be eaten alive anyway.
John has this moment where he decides not to shoot Captain Rhodes through the head after knocking him out. He looks at the dead body of Fisher and thinks, no, I don't want to be like Rhodes. But then he goes off into the zombie corral to help Bill and Sarah fight all the zombies in there and reach the missile silo and get to the helicopter. And he leaves the corral open. So really, he's dooming any soldiers who might be lying around unconscious to getting eaten anyway. Of course, he doesn't know there's a huge horde of zombies from outside about to come in to join them.
The reason the zombies got into the bunker is that Miguel has gone up on the elevator with his amputated arm and let all the zombies in. I suppose they meant to imply that he'd had enough of the whole thing and thought that everybody involved deserved to be eaten alive, which is a bit harsh.
George Romero was quite disappointed with his slashed budget. He wanted to make much more of an epic zombie movie involving a group of soldiers and scientists. I've always thought I think it benefits the movie, really, being on that small, enclosed, claustrophobic scale. It's quite like Night in that way.
One thing I noticed for the first time watching it recently was the polar opposite views of John and Dr. Logan. I mentioned God earlier. John is the character who talks about God. He's saying to Sarah, it's all this science that's gone too far. We shouldn't be cutting up and examining zombies, and we shouldn't have done half the things that people call progress either, and the human race is being punished, and that's why there are zombies. And then in the very next scene, Dr. Logan is explaining his theories about Bob, how he's us, a primitive human, and previously religion has been used in the way that he's using his own kind of conditioning to subdue people, bring people under control.
Sarah may be appalled by the nature of some of Dr. Logan's research, but she does approach the problem very scientifically in her own way. She's looking for some sort of viral cure, and her scientific mind thinks of this as the only thing there is left to do. But of course John points out to her what nonsense that is. There's plenty left to do. Live, really, is what John wants to do, and it's what John, Sarah and Bill go off and do in the end. Very satisfying to see them do so. Of course, I was talking about the military as the antagonists, the real monsters. There is a reason that they see Logan, Dr. Frankenstein, as the real monster. Part of his taming of Bob is to feed him bits of dead soldier to satisfy that part of his instinct. Sarah is horrified to discover at the beginning of the movie that while they've been away in the helicopter, the previous commanding officer, Major Cooper, has died somehow, and Dr. Logan has tricked the soldiers into burying a dead zombie and kept Major Cooper's body himself, and it's one of the bodies he's experimenting on as a zombie. It's the closest thing we get to a character as a zombie there, Major Cooper, but we haven't met him before he's a zombie, as the other characters have, and when he is a zombie, his face has all been cut off so nobody can recognise him, so it doesn't really count. But it is the way that Frankenstein is painted as perhaps as much of a subhuman monster in his own way as the zombies and the soldiers. There's even a theory that in some summaries is stated as a fact that Dr. Logan has murdered Major Cooper in order to have a fresh zombie to work on. Interestingly enough, perhaps interestingly, Day of the Dead is the only film of the three, and indeed the only film of the 6 George Romero films about zombies, if you want to count the second trilogy that doesn't really count, that isn't set, at least partially, in Pennsylvania, where George Romero and all his filmmaking buddies came from. They did a lot of interesting location work for the movies at the Monroeville Mall in Pennsylvania, Evans City Cemetery at the beginning of Night of the Living Dead. The roof of their own building in Pittsburgh plays the part of the top of the inner city housing project in Philadelphia at the beginning of Dawn of the Dead. But Day of the Dead is set entirely in Florida, and the piece of location filming they do with the helicopter trip at the beginning, with the dead city, and the alligator and the spider and the crabs crawling around amongst the zombies, is pretty striking. All the underground stuff, of course, was filmed in Pennsylvania, but it's set in Florida. Like Bram Stoker, Mary Shelley and Errol Flynn, George Romero created a piece of culture that has outlived him and will continue to endure. Our next podcast will be on the final Sunday in October. We'll be going back to the 1970s, or you could say back even further than that, to talk about one of ITV's best remembered and most internationally successful programs, Upstairs, Downstairs. Until then, thanks for joining us for this podcast, and
good night out there.
whatever you are.